Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 weapon tier list and guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're talking about staffs. Staffs are the ultimate caster weapon. They're almost always best in slot for wizards and sorcerers, and very frequently best in slot for druids, clerics, bards, and warlocks. Many monks will also be using a staff as well, so in an average party, more than half of your characters might be using a staff. Some characters even will be using two at once, so that means that unlike other weapons, it's important not only to know the best staff, but the second, third, and fourth best staff as well, because this weapon slot is so competitive, since so many characters might want to be using it, and there's actually not that many in the game, that you will often be reaching to find the best staffs to equip your party members with, and that's what we're going to talk about finding today. Just as with my previous weapon and item tier lists, I'll be rating these weapons based on when you get access to them during the game, because it doesn't really make sense to compare an Act 1 item directly to an Act 3 item most of the time, because the Act 3 item shows up much later. That means that as we go through the tiers, the items to the right within a tier will tend to be stronger in absolute terms, because they will show up much later in the game. Although I will say that with staffs, this is a little bit different because there are so few Act 2 staffs that it sort of changes how we're going to approach some of these things, but I will talk about that a little more when we get to Act 2. In S tier, I'm rating weapons that are the best in slot weapon for a wide variety of builds or particular very powerful builds. In A tier, weapons that make interesting alternatives to the S tier items. Maybe they enable a cool, unique strategy, or are useful for one very specific build. In B tier, items that are either situational, they work only in certain encounters, or are for sort of off-meta builds that aren't quite as powerful as the normal builds, but are still interesting and unique strategies enabled by these weapons. In C tier, items that are useful under some circumstances, but most parties won't have a particular need for them. And in D tier, items that most parties can safely ignore because they're typically worse than the other options available. Alright, let's just get right into it and start talking about staff. We're going to start with the humble, non-magical Quarterstaff. Quarterstaff is the base model for every magical staff in the entire game, so they all use the same base stats. It's a simple weapon, so just about any character can use it, and it's versatile, so you can either wield it one-handed for a d6 of base damage, or two-handed for a d8 of base damage. Alright, so that brings us to everyone's favorite segment in these videos, historical weapon rant. I have some opinions about this, because in real life, I spent several years learning to fight with quarterstaffs. I'm not like an expert in the field or anything, I'm not winning any tournaments anytime soon, but I more or less know what I'm doing. And so the characterization of quarterstaff as a versatile weapon that can be used in one hand is always somewhat bizarre to me. A quarterstaff is a long, heavy weapon. It's typically between 6 and 9 feet long, depending on the height of the user. It's always longer than you are tall. And that's the main advantage of the weapon, is that it is long and that it is heavy. Probably not quite as heavy as you're picturing, but very heavy for a weapon. What that means is that when you hold it in two hands and swing it, you generate a ton of momentum and force with the other end, because you sweep it through a huge amount of area, so it builds up a lot of momentum before impacting your target. Or, if you hold it with your, as you should, with your offhand at the base of the weapon, small movements of your offhand generate very large movements at the tip of the weapon at the other end. That lets you control a lot of space, because of how physics works. It's basically a big lever. And so you can cover a lot of ground with a weapon. You're probably picturing quarterstaffs fighting wrong, by the way. You should picture it more like fighting with a spear, if you have seen staff fighting in, like, movies and stuff. If you tried to hold a quarterstaff one-handed, you'd be giving up all of the advantages of the weapon. Suddenly the length and weight of it would be working against you, because you'd have to hold it sort of choked up near the end. Get your "that's what she said" jokes out of the way in the comments, I guess. You'd be much better off with just a 3-foot stick than a 9-foot stick held 2/3 of the way up, because now the rest of the staff, whenever you try to swing, would be generating a big awkward counterweight, which would cause you to not only hit yourself in the legs and stuff, but also just remove a lot of the momentum that you could generate by swinging it. So it would make it a very, very awkward weapon to try to use one-handed. You can actually see that in the motion capture in Baldur's Gate 3. They more or less copied the animations from clubs for the staff swings, and so the characters do this like awkward bonking motion that looks like it would sting, maybe, but not seriously inconvenience a person, let alone like a charging owlbear or something like that. Anyways, with that out of the way, in-game, the weapon's actually quite good. A Quarterstaff's d8 of damage when wielded two-handed, as you should, is the highest amount of damage that a simple non-magical weapon can do, and you can further enhance that by dipping it in fire. So that's actually the highest possible damage setup if your character only has simple weapon proficiency in the early game. For a monk or something like that, this is the best damage output that you can get right at the beginning of the game, is a Quarterstaff, spear, or great club that's on fire. Most characters with simple weapon proficiency will prefer to use a light crossbow, but if you're fighting in melee, then the Quarterstaff is a great option. The topple weapon action, which lets you knock an enemy prone, is also very, very good, because prone in Baldur's Gate 3 is of course an extremely powerful option, so for characters that are actually swinging melee weapons around, Quarterstaff makes a very good pick in the early game. For that reason, I'm going to give it B tier. Obviously, we want to swap out of it as soon as possible, but being the highest damage output simple weapon right from the start of the game actually means that a surprising number of characters will want to use it in very, very early game fights. The +1 Quarterstaff is available from merchants as sort of random merchant inventory right from the beginning of the game, so if you want to upgrade your basic Quarterstaff, you can buy one from a merchant right away, but you shouldn't, because most characters that want to use staffs won't be attacking with them frequently, and the ones that do want to attack with them will definitely have better weapon options available even right from the beginning of the game to swap their non-magical Quarterstaff to, so the +1 Quarterstaff is D tier. And the first of the magical staffs, the Cacophony. Cacophony is a +1 Quarterstaff that does an extra d4 of thunder damage on every attack. This one's intended to be used by a character that actually wants to attack with their staff, not a character that's just a spellcaster using it to enhance their spellcasting. In addition to the extra d4 of thunder damage, the Cacophony lets you cast Thunderous Smite once per short rest for an extra 2d6 of thunder damage and the chance of knocking your opponents prone. The character that most often wants to actually be attacking with a staff is a monk. And the Cacophony is a pretty good monk weapon overall. A +1 weapon with an extra d4 of thunder damage is not a bad choice, but the Thunderous Smite portion of it does have some anti-synergy with monk, because Thunderous Smite requires your bonus action as well as an attack to cast, and that eats monk's main feature, which is its extra bonus action attacks or flurry of blows. So the Cacophony is not as good for a monk as it might look at first glance, or at least the Thunderous Smite portion of it isn't particularly useful for a monk. That being said, if you're a weapon-attacking monk, you could definitely do worse than just a +1 weapon with an extra d4 of thunder damage. Most weapon monk builds will have tried to get better weapon proficiencies than staffs, but this is a totally reasonable option. And because it's one of the earliest thunder damage weapons available in the game, the Cacophony also has some synergy with reverberation builds, because you can use it alongside the Gloves of Belligerent Skies, conveniently available at basically the same location, in order to apply a lot of reverberation. So for a weapon-attacking monk or a reverberation build, the Cacophony has some usage. There's usually going to be better options for both of those characters, but the Cacophony is a totally reasonable one, so I'll give it B tier, because I think that it will see some play in somewhat unusual or specific builds, but most parties won't have a use for it. Next up, Corellon's Grace. Corellon's Grace is a magical quarterstaff, but with no enhancement bonus, so it attacks exactly the same as a normal quarterstaff. But while you're wearing it, while you're wielding it, you get a +1 bonus to your attack rolls and damage with unarmed strikes, and if you have no armor equipped, a +2 bonus to all of your saving throws. Obviously, this is intended as a monk weapon, and it's available right from the beginning of the game. So for monks who don't yet have Tavern Brawler, or monks who don't intend to take Tavern Brawler, this is going to be an excellent pick. The attack from the staff will be as good or better than your unarmed strikes, and the buff to your unarmed strikes will be extremely helpful for when you're doing your bonus action offhand attacks and your flurry of blows. And the +2 to saving throws in the early game can be invaluable for some of the early game fights. If you are intending to take Tavern Brawler, you will eventually want to put the Corellon's Grace down, because you will want to have either no weapons equipped or only an offhand weapon equipped. If you're a Tavern Brawler monk, because you just want to make as many unarmed strikes as possible, and the bonus from Tavern Brawler will wildly outclass the Corellon's Grace bonus. But if you are pre-Tavern Brawler in levels 1 to 3, when you can definitely have this weapon because it's available very early in the game, or aren't intending to take Tavern Brawler on your monk, then this is a great weapon. Definitely one that's worth looking out for. Really good defensively and also offensively for monks. The Corellon's Grace is S tier. Again, mostly for most monk builds, only for the very, very early game. But monks that aren't intending to take Tavern Brawler will keep this one for quite a bit longer. Creation's Echo. Creation's Echo is a magical quarterstaff, again with no enhancement bonus. But if the wielder deals acid, fire, lightning, radiant, or necrotic damage, notably, despite it being elemental damage, it doesn't work with cold damage, so only acid, fire, lightning, radiant, or necrotic, then they become resistant to that damage type for 2 turns. This buff is exclusive, so if you deal acid damage and then fire damage, the fire resistance will replace the acid resistance, and also uses the elixir buff slot. I think they just coded it to give you a resistance elixir. So this will eat whatever elixir you have equipped if you deal damage while using the Creation's Echo. Resistance is a reasonably powerful effect, but this is a resistance that you have to trigger by doing the appropriate damage type, and often enemies that do a damage type are also resistant to it, so you won't want to use fire damage against a fire elemental to gain fire resistance. That just doesn't make sense. And it doesn't buff any of your offensive capabilities. In addition, it eats your elixir slot, which is a real challenge, even in Act 1, and as you go on into later acts will become even worse. So the Creation's Echo is just not a weapon that I think is particularly good. It can be useful with stuff like Chromatic Orb in order to generate an appropriate resistance, but honestly you're better off just stockpiling resistance elixirs or using other ways to gain elemental resistances. There's maybe a couple fights in the early game where this one could come up, but for the most part I think it's pretty safe to ignore it. Since it shows up late in Act 1, I think that Creation's Echo, despite being a pretty cool weapon, it's purely defensive. The bonus is not great, and it eats your elixir slot, so I'm just going to give it D tier. I just don't think you should use this weapon. The Gold Wyrmling Staff. The Gold Wyrmling Staff is a +1 quarterstaff that deals an extra 1d4 of fire damage on every attack, and lets you cast the Firebolt cantrip at will. The extra d4 of fire damage looks exciting at first glance, but actually isn't, because it doesn't stack with dipping it in fire. You can't dip the weapons that are already on fire. So it's not actually a damage improvement over just a +1 quarterstaff that's been dipped in fire itself. So the Gold Wyrmling Staff saves you some clicks, but doesn't actually increase your damage output. On the other hand, the ability to cast Firebolt at will is seems like it's not going to be that good at first glance, but there's some characters that actually kind of benefit from it. Some characters get access to pretty bad damage cantrips. Druids, clerics, and bards don't have great damage cantrip options, and Firebolt is going to be an improvement over most of what those characters are using in the very early game. So if you have one of those characters who needs a cantrip upgrade, the Gold Wyrmling Staff gives you an at-will damage cantrip that's probably an improvement over what you have. If you're a character that might also be making melee weapon attacks, like a Spore Druid for example, the Gold Wyrmling Staff is really not bad for that kind of character, because it's a decent melee weapon that also gives you a solid ranged option, also in all in one package. Again, this is sort of for like very early game optimization. It's not going to significantly affect your long-term plans for these characters, but this may well be a weapon that you slot in for a level or two, and so I'm going to give it B tier for its use for like druids, clerics, and bards in the early game to give them a weapon they can attack with, and a good ranged attack as well. Melf's First Staff. Melf's First Staff, named of course for the wizard Melf, who is a character you can tell was named before the internet, is a +1 quarterstaff that gives you a +1 to your spell save DC and spell attack rolls, and also lets you cast Melf's Acid Arrow once per long rest, so a level 2 spell slot once per long rest. Acid Arrow is a pretty bad spell. It's not one that you would normally cast, but 6d4 of acid damage can be relevant in the early game. And so getting it for free is not the most exciting thing, but still pretty reasonable. But of course, the main attraction here is the +1 to spell save DC and spell attack rules. If you've been following any of my tier lists, you know that +1 to spell save DC is one of the most important things that an item or weapon can give you. Increasing your character's save DC just means that you are that much more likely to lock down enemies and win the encounter instantly, and it's exactly what any character who wants to wield a staff wants out of their item set. Melf's first staff improves the effectiveness of your spellcasters, whether they are making spell attacks like Eldritch Blast or Scorching Ray, or whether they're casting control spells like Command or Hypnotic Pattern, and it does so dramatically, so it's just going to improve your character's effectiveness enormously. One of the first ways to boost your spell save DC, and so it's just going to be critically important that spellcasters get and use this item, because it just improves their ability to do everything that they want to do. S tier for Melf's first staff. Probably best in slot for most spellcasters in all of Act 1 and all of Act 2. The Mourning Frost. The Mourning Frost is a +1 quarterstaff that deals an extra 1d4 of cold damage on every attack. And in addition to that, whenever you deal cold damage with this weapon equipped, you deal +1 cold damage. So it's effectively 1d4 +1 cold damage on every attack. Just like every other source of cold damage in Baldur's Gate, this can be doubled using the wet condition. So for a weapon attacker, if you can get an enemy wet, the Mourning Frost outputs a pretty significant amount of damage, because the 2d4 +2 cold damage that it does on every strike against a wet enemy adds up really, really quickly. On top of that, whenever you deal cold damage with a spell, the enemy has to make a DC 12 Constitution save or become chilled. Chilled, if an enemy makes enemies vulnerable to cold damage, just like the wet effect does, and if you apply wet to a chilled enemy, they become frozen and become stunned. So this will set up chilled to double its own damage and let you inflict stuns on a bunch of enemies. Now, the frozen only lasts for 1 turn, and so enemies will typically unfreeze at the start of their next turn, because the duration will tick down, and they will then just get to act normally. So it's not quite as exciting as it looks, but this still lets you pass out a lot of stuns and a lot of cold vulnerability to deal a ton of extra cold damage. On top of all that, it gives you Ray of Frost at will. All of that, to be said, this is the item that powers up cold damage the most. By rendering enemies vulnerable to cold damage whenever you cast a cold damage spell, and increasing all the cold damage that you deal, the Mourning Frost is going to be amazing for any character that's casting cold damage spells, and also any character that's making weapon attacks. So for any wizard or sorcerer who has cold damage as part of their kit, or any character that wants to actually attack with a staff, the Mourning Frost is going to be amazing. Ray of Frost at will, just like I mentioned with Firebolt at will with the gold Wyrmling staff, is also quite relevant for a lot of characters that might not have good cantrips. And this is souped up with Ray of Frost, because it does an extra cold damage and possibly inflicts chilled to further double its effect. So Ray of Frost as the best damage cantrip in the game, getting that on a weapon that's already a weapon you want to use and that synergizes with the effects of that is actually amazing. The Mourning Frost is going to be best in slot for a lot of characters throughout the entire game. Abjuration wizards who do a lot of cold damage, any character that is focused around dealing cold damage effects with things like Chromatic Orb or Ice Knife will use the Mourning Frost to great effect. It's also often held as a offhand weapon, even with Act 3 staffs, on into the extreme endgame. If you take dual wielder on your spellcasters, the Mourning Frost is usually the second staff that you're going to be carrying. And so any character that does any amount of cold damage wants this weapon. Also any character that's attacking with a staff, S tier of course for the Mourning Frost. The Nature's Snare. The Nature's Snare is a magical quarterstaff with no enhancement bonus, that whenever an enemy is hit with it, they have to make a DC 12 strength saving throw or become ensnared. Ensnare is a pretty powerful condition. Enemies who are ensnared can't move, attacks against them have advantage, their attacks have disadvantage, and they take damage every turn, which is a pretty potent set of effects to apply passively just by whacking an enemy with the Nature's Snare. This item honestly makes me a little bit sad, because it used to be really, really cool. The Snare effect used to work on any source of damage that you would deal while you had Nature's Snare equipped, so a character like a Warlock could use this to add ensnaring shots to their Eldritch Blasts, which was really, really awesome. You could do it with Scorching Ray for extra sources of ensnare, which made it a really great early game staff to lock down a bunch of enemies. Sadly, that was a bug and has been fixed, so only attacks from the Nature's Snare itself now apply the ensnaring effect. And as a quarterstaff without an enhancement bonus, it's somewhat hard to do that. That being said, characters that want to inflict a condition on every attack do exist, and ensnare is a powerful enough effect that it can be worth building around, although it's going to usually be worse than just doing a bunch of extra damage. I'm going to give the Nature's Snare C tier because I think that you can build around this weapon. You can do sort of entangle stuff by whacking enemies with it, but giving up the +1 enhancement bonus on your attacks is quite painful, and the lower amount of damage that it does is quite painful. And the fact that it's only a DC 12 strength check that you have to apply by being in melee with an enemy makes it a little less useful than it otherwise would be. Honestly, I think they could have kept it with the old form and it was just fine. Maybe a little on the powerful end, but fine and much cooler. As is, I think that you should usually avoid using this unless you're doing a themed build around ensnaring. The Pale Oak. The Pale Oak is a quarterstaff with no enhancement bonus that makes you immune to Druidic Vines. So basically it makes you immune to the Entangle spell, and it also lets you cast Faith Warden's Vines, which is the same as the Entangle spell, once per long rest. Getting to cast a level 1 spell once per long rest, even a decent one like Entangle, is not that exciting, and immunity to Entangle is also not particularly powerful. There are not that many enemies in the game that try to entangle you, and you've probably faced most of them by the time you actually get the Pale Oak. What this does let you do is cast Entangle yourself and stand in the middle of it and be immune to that, which is maybe kind of cool. Not something that I would recommend building around, but maybe you could make a build set around coaxing enemies into difficult terrain and entangle effects based around the Pale Oak, so I'll give it a generous C tier for that sort of very narrow use case. Rain Dancer. Rain Dancer has no enhancement bonus unless you cast Create Water once per short rest. Create Water is a level 1 spell, and a pretty good level 1 spell, but one that's duplicated by water bottles. Spending your weapon slot to be able to do something that you can do just by carrying a bottle of water does not strike me as a particularly good use of your weapon slot, especially because you have to actually buy this weapon. The main use would be to take showers at your camp. D tier for the Rain Dancer. The Staff of Arcane Blessing. The Staff of Arcane Blessing has no enhancement bonus unless you cast Bless once per long rest. That's pretty useful because Bless is often a drain on your character's resources. It's a very good spell that you want to spend spell slots on, so saving a spell slot on it is always going to be helpful. In addition to that, it gives you one of the most poorly written and confusing conditions in the entire game. The tooltip for this staff made my list of the top 5 worst tooltips in Baldur's Gate 3, because the staff says that it gives you, whenever you cast Bless, an additional 1d4 to your attack rolls, 1d4 to your saving throws, and 2d4 to your spell attacks. That's a lie. Those bonuses are not additional, but instead of the normal bonuses to Bless. So you only get an additional 1d4 to your spell attack rolls. Basically what it does is it takes the normal Bless effect and then adds another buff on top of it that gives you plus 1d4 to your spell attack rolls. The Staff of Arcane Blessing, therefore, is really, really powerful because an extra d4 to your spell attack rolls is really good if you are making spell attack rolls. So if you have a fire sorcerer who's casting Scorching Ray, or a warlock who's using Eldritch Blast, or just really any spellcaster who's casting Ray of Frost or Firebolt or any of the normal combat cantrips that you would want to cast, the extra d4 bonus to your spell attack rolls is very, very relevant. But it's not nearly as good as the tooltip says that this item is, so it's important to remember the distinction there. If you have a party that's making frequent spell attack rolls, the Staff of Arcane Blessing is going to be incredible. If your party isn't making, and has a character that casts Bless or passes out Bless using the buff on heal set and stuff like that, if you don't fill those conditions, then the Staff of Arcane Blessing won't do anything because all it enhances is your spell attack rolls. For that reason, I'm going to give it A tier, although I will say that this item is incredible if your party fills the conditions that make it good. The Staff of Crones. The Staff of Crones has no enhancement bonus and lets you cast Ray of Sickness once per short rest. Ray of Sickness is a level 1 spell, and a pretty weak level 1 spell. It's often not what you would want to spend your action doing, even when it's resource free. So even though getting a level 1 spell slot once per short rest is fine, it's a relevant effect, the fact that you have to use it on an action that's often worse than whatever your character would have been doing otherwise definitely holds this item back. You could maybe use this item if you were really, really hurting for spell slots, but in that case you're often better with this character just throwing a grenade or casting a scroll or doing something with a consumable item. Even an arrow, a consumable arrow, can often be better than a Ray of Sickness. So I just don't recommend spending your weapon slot on the Staff of Crones. It's going to render your character much less effective most of the time in exchange for being able to cast a spell that's just not that good. D tier. And finally, the last of the Act 1 staffs, the Spellsparkler. The Spellsparkler has no enhancement bonus, but whenever you deal damage with a spell or weapon, you gain 2 lightning charges. Lightning charges, while you have them, give you +1 to your attack rolls and +1 lightning damage on every damage instance that you deal. And when you get 5 of them, they discharge for an extra 1d8 lightning damage. This is pretty powerful if you're making a lot of attack rolls and also generating a lot of damage with spells or cantrips. So for characters that cast spells that multi-attack, like Scorching Ray or Eldritch Blast, the Spellsparkler can build up lightning charges pretty quickly and give you a lot of extra damage as a result of that. The additional damage that you get from this is better later in the game than when you first get the Spellsparkler, because let's say you're using it on a warlock. At the point where you get it, your warlock is probably only firing 1 or maximum 2 rays from their Eldritch Blast, but in the endgame they'll be firing 3 and building up all of the lightning charges in a single go, which can be pretty useful for the Spellsparkler to stack up its effect and then discharge immediately, and then you get all the extra damage and attack rolls all at once. For that reason, I'm going to give it A tier, because it's quite good on a fire sorcerer or a warlock, just a powerful weapon that can build a lot of lightning charges. Of course, it combines well with the other lightning charge gear for even more lightning charges, but it's not clear to me that it's better for those characters than just Melf Staff, which gives them +1 to save DC as well in a lot of circumstances, because sometimes you'll just want to cast a spell with those characters regardless. But it is a powerful option for those characters that will stay relevant, and it can be part of some pretty broken builds. On lower difficulty settings as well, lightning charges are quite buggy in terms of damage rider stuff, and can apply the damage riders to multiple attacks. They can apply to attacks that they shouldn't be applying to. They can let you get agonizing blast damage on top of the lightning damage, and then lightning damage from that agonizing blast damage. So there's a lot of bugs you can abuse with this weapon as well. But it's also just at baseline a pretty solid weapon for any character that's making multiple spell attacks in a turn. So, at the end of Act 1, most spellcasters will be either using Melf's first staff if they focus on control spells, or the Mourning Frost if they focus on dealing damage, because dealing cold damage with the Mourning Frost is the most powerful damage setup you can have at the end of Act 1 on a spellcasting staff. If you have characters that make a lot of spell attack rolls in your party, you will be using the Staff of Arcane Blessing, and a warlock or a fire sorcerer may be using the Spellsparkler in order to generate a lot of lightning charges and do extra damage that way. Non-Tavern Brawler monks might still have Corellon's Grace equipped, but probably by the end of Act 1 you have better options available in other weapon categories. Act 2 for staffs is really funny. There's actually only 2 staffs in all of Act 2. It's kind of a bizarre design decision. I'm not sure entirely why they did it that way. But it does mean that the Act 1 staffs that we've gotten are going to be our setup for staff-wielding characters throughout all of Act 2, most likely. Bigboy's Chew Toy, which I've actually misspelled here, in the same way that the joke in the flavor text of the item suggests that a lot of people misspell it. It's actually Bigboy's Chew Toy, not Bigby's Chew Toy. Is not going to change that. It's a +1 quarterstaff that lets you cast Who's a Large Fellow, which is the same as the Enlarge spell, once per long rest, so it slightly increases your damage output. This is a level 2 spell once per long rest, which in Act 2 is just not that exciting, And a +1 Quarterstaff is not the type of weapon you want to actually be attacking with, which is what a character who wants enlarge would want from a weapon. So there's just no character that really wants this effect. A D tier for big boys, chew toy. The Incandescent Staff gives you a +1 to your ranged spell attack rolls, resistance to fire damage, Firebolt at will, the cantrip Firebolt at will, and Fireball once per long rest. I'm going to go through each of these abilities in turn. The +1 to spell attacks is useful, but generally speaking outperformed by Melf's Staff, which gives you +1 to attacks and save DCs, and also mostly outperformed by the Spellsparkler, which gives you +1 to attacks, as well as all the lightning charge stuff. Resistance to fire damage is always relevant, but by Act 2 you have a lot of potential sources of fire resistance, so it's not something we'd go out of our way for on our weapon. And Firebolt as a cantrip is not exciting for characters that want the +1 bonus to spell attacks, because they either already have Firebolt, because they're like a sorcerer or something, or have Eldritch Blast, because they're a warlock, and so have a better cantrip already. The main draw here, therefore, is the Fireball, once per long rest. A level 3 spell once per long rest is a lot more exciting to me than level 1 and level 2 spell slots, because level 3 spells are much more valuable. They tend to be your best spells for a lot of characters, and Fireball's really not bad in Act 2, where there's a lot of fights against large groups of enemies, so this can be a very relevant spell for some encounters, and actually improves your longevity on your adventuring day. If you do sub it in for an encounter, the +1 to spell attacks will probably be relevant during that encounter as well. It'll be worse than whatever other bonus you'd have had from a different staff, but still pretty reasonable. And so you can definitely use this for one encounter a day just to squeeze in an extra Fireball. If you're taking very, very long adventuring days, then the Incandescent Staff is something that can come in for one encounter per day to help pry a big group of enemies, and then you sub back to your normal staff for the rest of the day. If you're a dual-wielding character, this makes an okay offhand staff as well, because it lets you add +1 to your attack rolls in addition to the bonus from the first staff or the Spellsparkler, and also throw in the Fireball and fire resistance and everything as well. I'm going to give it B tier because it is mostly for subbing in for one encounter, but also for dual-wielding characters, this makes a good second option for your staff. The +2 Quarterstaff, I only know of guaranteed locations to get this in Act 3, but I think you can find it from merchant inventory randomly, starting at level 9, just like the other +2 items. At this point, you aren't attacking with your staffs mostly anyways, and the characters that are still probably using the Mourning Frost is just better than the +2 staff. So again, just like the +1 staff, D tier for the generic +2. No particular need to summarize Act 2, since there were only 2 weapons there. So let's move on to Act 3 and the Caitiff Staff. The Caitiff Staff, or Caitiff if you're following the Vampire the Masquerade pronunciation guide, but the English word's usually pronounced Caitiff. It means like a despicable person, a scumbag, basically. The Caitiff Staff gives you a +1 to your spell save DC and +1 to your spell attack rolls. It's a +2 staff itself. And once per long rest, you can restore an expended warlock spell slot. That's, for a warlock, going to be a level 4 or level 5 spell slot. If you're like a warlock paladin multiclass, you can use this to restore high-level spell slots in order to use smites. You can also use this to restore warlock spell slots and then convert them into sorcery points to generate long rest resources out of this, but overall that just gives you extra warlock spell slots for additional warlocking. If you've been using Melf's first staff on your warlock, this is obviously just a strict upgrade to that at this point, and this is also the first, in Act 3, this is probably the easiest staff to get that increases your spell save DCs, so it's likely the first that you'll get access to in order to have +1 to save DCs on both of your staffs if you are going for a dual-wielding staff build and want to boost your save DCs that way. For a warlock, this is a very solid option. For other characters, this makes a decent option if you are dual-wielding staffs. And while a long rest restoration of a warlock spell slot isn't that exciting, it's still just a nice little bonus to have. A tier for the Caitiff Staff. This is not something that I'm like that excited by, but it is going to be a solid role player if you want to pick it up for a character that can use it. The Despair of Athkatla. The Despair of Athkatla is a +2 staff that gives you a +1 bonus to your spell save DC and spell attack rolls. It's a little harder to get because you have to actually do a fight for it than the Caitiff Staff, but it is nice if you just need more staffs that give you a +1 bonus to your spell save DC and spell attack rolls. So if you have 2 characters that can use this effect, one of them's dual wielding, then maybe you want the Despair of Athkatla. Given that you have a lot of access to this effect, though, and this is the worst version of it, I'm just going to give it C tier. If you have like an all-wizard party, then the Despair could maybe come into play. Otherwise, it probably won't. The Harper Sacredstriker. The Harper Sacredstriker is a +1 quarterstaff that lets you cast Spiritual Weapon at 6th level once per long rest. A 6th level spell once per long rest sounds pretty exciting. That's the type of thing that you really want a staff or item to give you. But having to spend it on an upcast sacred weapon or spiritual weapon definitely makes it a little bit less interesting. Spiritual weapon upcasts oddly. It only gains bonuses every 2 levels that you upcast it. It gets an extra 8 HP and an extra d8 of damage for every 2 levels. So at level 6, it's gotten plus 16 HP and plus 2d8 damage. 3d8 damage a turn from a spell cast at this point in the game is okay. It's not amazing, but it only costs you a bonus action. But it's sort of hard for your spiritual weapon to actually do stuff at this point because enemies in Act 3 are just so mobile that they'll pretty easily be able to get away from it, and fights are often over so quickly that the spiritual weapon just won't be able to attack. So even spending your bonus, and you also often have much better uses for your bonus action. The main use of spiritual weapon at this point in the game is just distracting an enemy for 1 attack, and the upcast version won't do that much more than that. Maybe it eats a 2nd attack, but if so, it was probably a sort of weak attack again at this point in the game. So the Harper Sacredstriker is not that much more exciting as a 6th level spiritual weapon than it would be as a 2nd level spiritual weapon. I think that this item can still see some use, because a bonus action spell that does 3d8 force damage is still okay, and something that I would not be like embarrassed to carry around. So you could use it in 1 encounter and then swap it out, do something else with your weapons after that, or carry it as a 2nd weapon. But for the most part, I think that this weapon is just not that interesting, so I'm going to put it in C tier. Hollow's Staff. Hollow's Staff is a +1 quarterstaff that does an extra 1d4 of necrotic damage, and gives enemies disadvantage on your saving throws against necromancy spells. The most powerful necromancy spell to use this on is probably Eyebite, because it has a lot of powerful debuffs associated with it. Most necromancy spells with saving throws are just damage, so you're not actually going to be getting like super powerful debilitating effects to land more frequently out of this, but you will increase your damage on mediocre damage spells like Blight and Circle of Death. In addition, it lets you cast Arms of Hadar once per long rest as a level 3 spell. And a level 3 Arms of Hadar, which does some necrotic damage and a small AoE in melee range, is almost certainly not worth your action at this point in the game. So the main question is, are you casting enough necromancy spells that makes disadvantage on saving throws against them worth it? Since you can get this pretty early in Act 3, and it works on Eyebite, which is a pretty powerful effect if enemies are consistently failing your saving throws against it, I'm going to give it B tier, although I will say I think that's probably a little bit on the generous side, but for a debuffing build focused around Eyebite, Hollow's Staff is actually pretty cool. And it's time to once again talk about one of the items I've probably mentioned the most number of times across all of my Baldur's Gate 3 guides, Markoheshkir. Markoheshkir is a +2 staff. It's the only legendary staff in the game, and it has a whole bunch of effects. The first of these is you get +1 to your spell save DC and spell attack rolls. Obviously, that in and of itself is pretty great. We've already talked about that already. The second is that once per long rest, you can toggle on its passive. It doesn't take an action to toggle this on, and the next spell you cast won't cost a spell slot. That basically means you get 2 level 6 spells per day. It lets you cast an extra 6th level spell, so you can double cast 6th level spells to just obliterate 1 encounter. You can use it to set up a day-long 6th level buff, like a powerful summon or Hero's Feast or something like that, and then still have a 6th level spell for a fight. Obviously that's amazing. 6th level spells are are the single most valuable resource in the game. They're the most powerful thing a character can do, and so getting to do that more often is always great. In addition to that, Markoheshkir lets you attune to one of 6 elements, and depending on which element you attune to, it gives you different spells that you can cast once per short rest. For example, if you attune to lightning, it lets you cast Lightning Bolt and Chain Lightning once per short rest, gives you extra damage on all of your lightning damage, and gives you lightning charges whenever you deal damage. The different effects are thematic to the element. You can use lightning, cold, fire, thunder, poison, or acid. But most characters are going to want to attune to lightning because it's the only one that gives you a 6th level spell. It lets you cast Chain Lightning once per short rest. So that means that Markoheshkir attuned to lightning effectively gives you 4 extra 6th level spell slots every day, more if you have bards in your party. And that obviously is ludicrously powerful. In addition to that, the Chain Lightning from Markoheshkir is still bugged, and if you're a sorcerer, you can twin it, even though you can't twin normal Chain Lightning, so it's even more broken than that. The vast majority of characters are going to be best off just attuning to Lightning, because 6th level spells are broken, and that's the only one that gives you a 6th level spell, but if you are specialized into one of the other 6 elements, then obviously the element that Markoheshkir, the elemental attunement from Markoheshkir is super powerful for those characters as well. If you're a fire sorcerer, attuning to fire is amazing. And one other attunement worth mentioning, just as a sort of generically strong one, is the acid attunement from Markoheshkir, which gives you access to Hunger of Hadar. If your party doesn't have Hunger of Hadar, there are some encounters in the late game that spell just wins, so you can get access to it by spending the attunement from Markoheshkir on acid attunement for hunger. Admittedly, that's a very, very resource-intensive way to get a level 3 warlock spell, cast at level 5, but still. But that is worth mentioning. The vast majority of the time, though, you're just going to want to attune this to lightning on any character. Markoheshkir is the best in slot staff for every spellcaster in the game, pretty much. And in fact, a lot of spellcaster builds aren't so much about finding the item that complements the build, but about maximizing the build to make the best use of this item, because it's just one of the most powerful items in the game. And so finding ways to use it more powerfully is actually one of the best things that you can do when building a character. I don't really need to go on and on about how powerful this item is any more than I have already, though I could for another many minutes because of how many cool things it lets you do. But Markoheshkir, it's the legendary staff, it's the best in slot for every spellcaster in the game, and you're definitely going to want to use it. Which character you gets it is going to be the most important decision with Markoheshkir, but it is not a difficult decision to place it in S tier. The Staff of a Mumbling Wizard. This is one of the joke items that you get from the Carnival. It lets you cast Firebolt, at will, which is a normal Firebolt, except unlike normal Firebolt, it doesn't scale with your level. It'll always do 1d10 damage, but it has a 1 in 20 chance of being a fireball instead. The way that this works is actually the enemy has to roll a saving throw that's not modified by anything, which does yield some slightly weird effects, because if you have things that trigger off of enemies failing saving throws, they can trigger off of the Staff of a Mumbling Wizard. So there are some like weird things that can happen, because it's always a DC 20, and you get a fireball if they pass the save. If they roll exactly a 20, then you get a fireball, and if they don't, then you get a firebolt. So 19 out of 20 times they count as failing a save, which lets you trigger some very weird things with this, but of course you have to spend your action doing some pretty bad spellcasting in order to make use of it. So the Staff of a Mumbling Wizard, very odd interactions, but it's intended to be a joke item, and it basically is D tier, even though it's kind of cool, and I keep wanting to find something neat to do with this item, but it just, the base use case of a 1d10 firebolt is just not powerful enough to make any of the interactions worth pursuing, I think. The Staff of Cherished Necromancy. The Staff of Cherished Necromancy is a +2 staff that does an extra 1d4 of necrotic damage on hit, and has the same heightened necromancy passive that Hollow's staff does, where enemies have disadvantage against your necromancy spells. In addition to that, whenever you kill an enemy with a spell, you gain a stack of life essence, which you can then spend to cast your next necromancy spell for free. This effect used to be bugged, and it wouldn't consume the life essence when you cast a necromancy spell, so it basically read, you can cast all your necromancy spells for free forever. But they have since fixed that bug, and so you only get one free spell per creature that you kill, which is still incredibly powerful because free spells are amazing. And of course, the staff is self-synergistic because those free spells are damaging necromancy spells, which enemies have disadvantage on the saving throw against, so they're going to take a lot of damage, letting you kill more enemies, generating more life essence to continuously generate an influx of more free spells. Although you have to spend these level 6 spell slots on necromancy spells, which are typically fairly weak, the fact that you don't have to spend a spell slot on them makes this incredible. Level 6 Blight, for example, Upcast, is an awesome use of an action. It's not spell slot efficient, but when it doesn't cost you a spell slot, that's a great way to spend your turn, just doing a big pile of necrotic damage. It's true that there are some enemies that are immune to necrotic damage in the late game, but you can just cast your normal spells when you go up against those. The Staff of Cherished Necromancy is the only staff in the game that's competitive with Markoheshkir if you're doing a lot of necromancy stuff, just because the influx of free actions that it gives you are incredible. And of course it makes an amazing dual wield option with Markoheshkir for just the most free spells available in the entire game, just constantly stacking additional free spells from both of your staffs. S tier, even for the nerfed Staff of Cherished Necromancy, because the influx of spell slots that it gives you is just absurd. The Staff of Interruption. The Staff of Interruption is a +2 staff that lets you cast Counterspell as a level 5 spell once per long rest. A level 5 Counterspell is a pretty powerful effect, so while this obviously costs you a weapon slot, the Staff of Interruption makes a pretty good safety button for a lot of parties. For one thing, you don't have to know Counterspell in order to use the Staff of Interruption, so it lets a character that couldn't normally interact with an enemy spellcaster do so in an extremely powerful way. So you can equip the Staff of Interruption for any fight where you're going up against a spellcaster and might need an extra counterspell. In addition, it makes a great offhand staff for a spellcaster, because extra charges of counterspell are always valuable. But the main usage here is going to be to put it on a character like an archer or something like that doesn't really need their main weapon slot in order to give that character access to counterspell, even if they wouldn't normally have it. For that usage, it's very good. Counterspell is one of the best actions in the game. It's the single most important defensive reaction in the game, because it just trades your reaction for the enemy's entire turn and their most important resource, and can stop some of the most devastating effects in the game from affecting you. So the Staff of Interruption just makes a great safety option to have in any party. For that reason, it's going into A tier. It's not going to compete with the very best staffs, which are more offensively focused, but this is a great option to have available, and one that I think you should pay attention to. I think this item is quite underrated. The Staff of Spellpower. The Staff of Spellpower gives you +1. It's a +2 staff. It gives you +1 to your spell save DC and spell attack rolls, and also has Arcane Battery, just like Markoheshkir, letting you once per day cast your next spell for free. Obviously, this staff is strictly worse than Markoheshkir, because Markoheshkir does exactly the same things, but then also has the elemental attunement. But it turns out that a strictly worse Markoheshkir is still an absolutely busted item. An extra 6th level spell slot every day is going to be amazing for any party with any spellcasters can make use of this. And you can always use it to set up a day-long buff or something, and still have your 6th level spell slot for combat, or to cast multiple day-long buffs if you are using camp casters or whatever. So the Staff of Spellpower is just going to be a mainstay. Refreshing your spell slots is just that good, and the fact that you can use this on any spell slot for any purpose makes it incredible. Again, you can Nova with it, you can day-long buff with it, the possibilities are as endless as 6th level spells, or spells in general, and so the Staff of Spellpower, of course, is also S tier. The Staff of the Emperor. The Staff of the Emperor is a +2 staff that I think probably most players haven't seen, because you have to disarm the Emperor in order to get it. It gives you +1 to your spell save DC and spell attack rolls, which is already not bad in and of itself, of course. And whenever you succeed on a saving throw, the enemy that made you make the saving throw has to themselves pass an intelligence save or become stunned. Intelligence is a really good save to target, of course, because a lot of enemies in the game have very, very low intelligence saving throws. And stun is a devastating condition, of course. So being able to pass out free stuns to enemies that just require you to succeed on a save is pretty powerful. Obviously, the enemies have to get an action in order to make this happen. And in the late game, you will often try to prevent enemies from getting an action. But late game spellcasters will often have good ways to succeed on saving throws that they get targeted by, and so you can pass out a lot of stuns with the defensive power of the Staff of the Emperor. In particular, characters with high armor class and high saving throws can use this in order to become basically invincible. Enemies can't hurt them with physical attacks, target them with spells, and get stunned, then that's a pretty powerful combo. But also just the fact that this is a powerful passive benefit that stuns enemies, again, I want to emphasize, it stuns them without you taking an action to do that, is pretty cool. I've thought about ways that you could maybe trigger this on purpose. For example, if you, I tried this out and it didn't work, but I thought, if you're concentrating on a spell, and you provoke an attack of opportunity, the enemy attacks you, and you have to pass a concentration save. Does that trigger the stun? It didn't work when I tested that, but if there are other ways that you can think of in the comments to trigger this effect on purpose, rather than waiting for the enemies to cast an effect against you, definitely let me know, because if we could figure out a way to proactively use this, it would be incredible. But even as is, I think the Staff of the Emperor just makes a really solid defensive piece. It gives you a lot of the bonuses that you want from a staff, and is going to stun some enemies, like a couple enemies per combat on average, if your combats tend to go long, and if you have more defensively oriented parties, and that's a very powerful effect. I'm going to give it A tier, because obviously it's not as good as the staffs that you generally want to focus on, but the Staff of the Emperor is such a powerful and passive benefit that it's definitely worth including as like an offhand staff or an additional staff if you need an extra one for your party. The Staff of the Ram. The Staff of the Ram is a +2 staff that once per turn, when you hit an enemy with it, they have to pass a DC 8, you heard that right, 8 Constitution save, or they get knocked backwards 7 feet and stunned. I can only assume that the saving throw here is bugged, and was not intended to be DC 8, because pretty much every enemy in the game at this point will auto-pass a DC 8 saving throw. Even if you give them disadvantage with bleeding, enemies will often have like a +4, +5 bonus to Constitution saves at this point in the game, so it can be very, very hard to land a DC 8 save. Maybe if you stack a bunch of reverberation and stuff to reduce their con saves and give them disadvantage, then you can land this. And if you do that, then it's certainly not bad, because stun, of course, is a very, very powerful action, and so being able to stun one enemy per turn is pretty good. The fact that this only works once per turn definitely does hold it back, and it's not once per turn per enemy, it's just once per turn no matter how many attacks you make. And the fact that the saving throw is so horribly low makes the Staff of the Ram much less interesting. It also means you have to use a pretty suboptimal weapon in order to use it, but it does have the word stun in it, so I don't want to entirely discount it. I'm going to give it C tier because you could build around it very, very heavily in order to trigger the stun, but DC 8 is just too unreliable at this point in the game, and it costs you a lot of damage output to equip this over a more powerful weapon. And finally, Woe. Woe, dude. So the Woe is a +2 Quarterstaff, with the same +1 to spell save DCs and spell attack rolls that a lot of the other staffs have. In addition to that, it lets you cast Blight once per long rest, which is an okay effect to have. I mean, it's a level 4 Blight, which is a pretty good action to have. Blight's not a great spell, but when you're not spending a spell slot on it, it's a lot more enticing. But generally, of course, you'd rather just get tons of free Blights with the Staff of Cherished Necromancy. In addition to that, when enemies fail a save against your spells, you heal for 1d4. So anytime an enemy fails a saving throw against a spell, you heal for 1d4. Hit multiple enemies, you will heal multiple times if they all fail the save. That's a reasonable amount of healing, and the free blight once per turn and the additional spell save DC and additional attack rolls are not bad. So you can generate a decent amount of healing and a decent amount of damage out of the woe, and it's certainly not a bad alternative to the other staffs available. But it's like the 5th copy of the +1 DC staffs that we have, and I think it's overall the worst of them, except for the Despair of Athkatla. It's better if you're still using Melf's first staff at this point in the game, because you have a lot of spellcasters in your party, then it will be an upgrade to that. But obviously it's worse than Markoheshkir, it's worse than the Cherished Necromancy staff. I think it is worse than the staff of the Emperor. So overall, it's going to be a rare party that makes use of it. I'm going to give it B tier, because it's not a bad item in and of itself. It's got a good spell attached to it and a powerful effect. But it is mostly just outclassed by the other options available that do the same thing, but better. So, at the end of Act 3, obviously every spellcaster is going to be looking out for Markoheshkir, and the main decision that you're making in Act 3 is which character in your party gets this extremely powerful staff. In addition to that, if you are killing enemies with your caster, the Staff of Cherished Necromancy can help them continuously do that, and so the influx of free spell slots that it provides gives your party a ton more longevity and power. And of course, once per long rest, you're going to slot in the Staff of Spellpower in order to get another 6th level spell slot in addition to that. On top of that, more defensively minded characters might be using the Staff of Interruption, or the Staff of the Emperor, and of course, cold damage focused characters may still have Mourning Frost equipped because the vulnerability to cold damage that it gives is still just an incredibly powerful effect. Alright, my friends, I hope that you enjoyed this look at all of the staffs in Baldur's Gate 3, and I hope it helps you get your wizards, sorcerers, warlocks, bards, clerics, druids, and monks kitted out appropriately. Staff is a really interesting weapon slot because there's so few of them and they're so heavily in demand in a lot of party setups. So hopefully this helps you make sure that your honor mode parties are appropriately geared out with the best staffs available to them. As always, of course, if you disagree with any of my rankings, think that I missed something about an item, or need to move things around, definitely do let me know. I'm always open to making changes based on good arguments that I see in the comments, so definitely if you think there's something that I messed up, please don't hesitate to say so. And of course, if you have enjoyed the video, then feel free to leave a comment and hit like. Helps me out a ton with the algorithm when people do that, so I really appreciate you taking the time to push those buttons. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 and other strategy game analysis. Cheers, my friends. I'll catch you next time.